To see little old me. My name is Tyler Aquilina. I'm a media analyst for Variety Intelligence Platform. We're a premium subscriber tier of Variety featuring data and analysis on the trends driving media and entertainment. Today, I'll be presenting some data from our latest special report featuring exclusive insights from Luminate, the entertainment industry's partner for data and insights, who actually partnered with us on this report, so thank you, Luminate. But on a more somber note, what we're really here today to do, friends, is to commemorate the death of peak TV. Born circa 2013, died 2023. 10 glorious years of this strange and wonderful period in Hollywood history when it seemed like TV could do anything. Like, say, a blockbuster prestige drama featuring dragons and ice zombies. We all remember that one, right? Or how about a network dramedy featuring a mature, nuanced treatment of mental health issues combined with extravagant musical numbers? Anybody know that one? It ran for 4 seasons. Crazy. Or how about an animated sitcom, a really, really sad animated sitcom about a talking horse? Turns out it's one of the best TV shows ever. Who knew? And in fact, this was an era that gave us many of the most beloved and well-remembered TV shows in history, along with a whole mess of shows that none of you ever watched. It's okay. I didn't either. None of us did. None of us could. That was peak TV, right? There were just so many shows of such high quality that no one could hope to keep up with everything, not even those of us who cover TV for a living. I think we all got used to friends and family recommending us that one show that we absolutely had to watch. You have to put it on our list. And we promised, yes, okay, we will. We'll get it to it. We'll put it on our list, even though we knew full well that we were never going to get to it. You know the one. You can admit it. We're all friends here. But that was another thing that was great about peak TV, was that there was something for everyone. There was something for every niche. I'm curious, actually, poll of the room. What were some of your favorite TV shows from the last 5-10 years? You can just shout them out. Breaking Bad, Succession, I heard, White Lotus. Mr. Robot. We got one Mr. Robot fan in the house. That's great. Hacks, sure. Ted Lasso, that's a good one. Ooh, Dark, yes. I'm hearing a lot of recent shows, which is good. That proves that people were actually watching these shows. I think some of these CEOs will be glad to hear this. Yeah, that's great. I'm also curious, show of hands, how many of you, like within the last year or two, have rewatched an old show like, say, Gilmore Girls or Friends or Grey's Anatomy, something like that? Most people, okay, yeah. How many of you, those shows you just shouted out, those newer shows, how many of you have watched those shows more than once? Okay. Less of you, but that's more than I expected, honestly. All right, interesting. This will illuminate some of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. But yes, that was peak TV, a moment of silence for our dearly departed era. Hey, at least we'll always have all those great shows you guys mentioned, as long as their corporate parents don't pull them off of their streaming platforms someday. That could still happen. But we're not just here today to celebrate the life of peak TV. We're here to do an autopsy of sorts. We're here to figure out what it was exactly that killed peak TV. So what you're looking at here, by the way, if you scan that QR code in the corner, you'll get to sign up for our new Variety Vitals newsletter for free. So please take advantage of that. I hope you're all doing that and not just taking photos of the chart. But what you're looking at here is basically a timeline of peak TV from 2003 to 2023. It's really a chart of TV output, both scripted and unscripted. I'm not John Landgraf. I'm not just going to be talking about scripted shows, if anyone knows who he is. Google him later. So the green data on the bottom there is broadcast TV, the orange is cable TV, and the blue is subscription streaming, or what we call SVOD, subscription video on demand. That's your services like Netflix, Disney+, et cetera. So the first thing that we should really take note of here is that 2022 was the year that TV finally actually peaked. The term peak TV was coined well before TV output finally crested and then fell. Luminate data shows 2023 saw a drop in original series output across all these platforms, plunging from more than 2,000 titles in 2022 to just over 1,600 last year. That's a 20% drop year over year, and that came after, as you see, 2 decades of almost continuous growth. There was never more than a 7% dip. There was one for the writer's strike in 2007, 2008, and one for COVID, of course. But that 20% drop last year was the steepest drop we've seen in recent history in TV output. And what really makes this time different, in fact, you'll notice in 2020, of course, there was that dip for COVID I just mentioned. After that, production bounced back, and not only did it bounce back, it bounced even higher. TV output soared to unprecedented levels in 2021 and 2022. And that's what makes this time different. Production isn't going to bounce back to peak levels anytime soon, by all indications. So the question is, what killed peak TV? Was it the strikes last year, the SAG-AFTRA and WGA strikes that put production on hold for months on end? Was it the streaming wars that we've all heard so much about as all these companies poured billions of dollars into content to compete with Netflix? Or was what killed peak TV itself? This unsustainable glut of content where the supply of TV shows far exceeded demand? Well, to answer that question, let's quickly retrace the life of peak TV, starting at the very beginning of this chart here. Now, I mentioned peak TV was really born circa 2013, but you can trace its ancestry back all the way to the early 2000s, because this is when cable networks realized that they could make themselves more valuable to viewers and therefore gain bigger audiences by creating slates of original programming that viewers wouldn't be able to find anywhere else. It makes sense, right? If you want to watch this show that you really care about, you have to come to this network. There's no other place to watch it. And HBO was really the gold standard of this. In the late 90s into the early 2000s, they produced all these great shows like The Sopranos, Sex and the City, that were not just widely beloved by critics and won a lot of awards. They were also really popular among audiences. So everybody was really trying to be HBO. Well, I shouldn't say that. Not everybody. Any fans of Adult Swim in here, the Cartoon Network block? Well, that started in the early 2000s for exactly this reason that I'm talking about, right? It was to give the channel more of a brand identity beyond just showing all these old cartoons that their corporate parent just happened to own. And because that's what cable TV was at the time, if anyone here is old enough to remember, it was a lot of reruns, a lot of movies that the corporate owners of these networks just happened to own, and that's how they filled all this time. And so introducing original content into that mix was a good way to draw more viewers to the networks. And it worked. It was wildly successful. A key tipping point here is 2008. That's when AMC's Mad Men became the first basic cable show to win the Emmy for Best Drama Series. And following that, many, many more networks started to follow this gold rush and start producing their own original content to try to keep up. Now, in the early 2010s, we see this explosion of shows on cable. Just as I say, more and more networks are getting into the original content game. And then in 2013, there's another new entrant onto the stage, of course, Netflix. 2013 is when they launched their original content slate with House of Cards, Orange is the New Black. And this was also a key tipping point in the history of TV, because 2013 was the first time when the FCC measured an annual drop in US pay TV subscribers. In other words, that's when cord cutting really got going for the first time, started being whispered about in Hollywood circles. And we all kind of know what happened from there, right? By the late 2010s, scripted TV output on cable was actually peaking. It peaked in 2017, well before we all started talking about the death of peak TV. And that's because the death of peak TV really happened in 2 phases. First, there was the linear TV phase, then there was the streaming phase. So as cable was starting to decline, cord cutting started accelerating, streaming was expanding, more and more people were moving to Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, Hulu at this time, and all these streamers were introducing more original content. Netflix started ramping up, putting out hundreds of shows a year, and that drew more viewers away from cable, drew money away from cable, and so the amount of shows being released on cable starts to go down. But that's okay, because streaming is making up the difference, right? And then in 2020, that's when the streaming wars really get going. Disney Plus launched late 2019. The platform formerly known as HBO Max launches 2020. Peacock, all these platforms start competing for viewers and producing these huge slates of original content in order to do that. It's basically the same thing that happened on cable, right? One network strikes gold with original content. This time it's Netflix, and everybody starts chasing that gold. The gold rush is time-honored Hollywood tradition. Everybody always goes where success starts to pop up. So, as I said, in 2021 and 2022, the amount of original content on streaming just balloons, and that's why we get such absolute highs in TV output. But 2022, another tipping point. If you can remember, 2022 is when Netflix loses subscribers in a quarter for the first time. Q1 of that year, they report their first drop in subscribers. It's a small drop, but it's enough to make everybody freak out and pretty much change the calculus around streaming pretty much overnight. All of a sudden, Wall Street investors are paying a lot more attention to how much money these companies are spending and how much they're losing on these streaming platforms. As I've said, they were pouring billions of dollars into original content in order to compete with Netflix, and they were racking up just massive deficits in the process. And so all of a sudden, everybody's paying a lot more attention to this. Previously, they'd been paying attention to subscriber totals, right? Everybody wanted to know, how many subscribers does your streaming platform have? We don't really care how much you're spending on all this content. As long as your content is winning subscribers and the subscriber total's going up, then you're all good. But if people are paying attention to how much money you're spending, how much money you're losing, that's a big problem. And it has been a big problem these last couple of years for the industry. So, with this in mind, all of these legacy media companies who aren't anywhere close to turning a profit in streaming, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, Paramount, they're all of a sudden having to cut back on what they're spending. And if they're doing that, they can't make as many TV shows, right? So that's how the amount of shows being released starts to contract. And then the strikes really just piled on top of that. Now, this is really this is why we can say that peak TV has died. Because it should be clear at this point that there were multiple factors behind the death of peak TV, but the drop in SVOD titles is really what sealed it last year. 2023 was the first year since Netflix got into original content when the number of original shows released on SVOD fell. It went from almost 1,000 in 2022 to less than 800 last year. And this is because of that macroeconomic backdrop that I was talking about, right? Studios are cutting back on expenses to get streaming to profitability. They can't make as many shows. And as a result, the number of shows drops. And again, that's why we can say now that peak TV is dead, because streaming output is not going to bounce back in the near future. And we know that because the major streaming players have been cutting back on spending for about 2 years now. If you look at these charts here, this is global content spending by the major media and tech companies. This chart on the left is the aggregate total of all these companies combined. Includes the legacy media companies I was talking about, Netflix, as well as the big tech players in streaming, Amazon and Apple. So that total was essentially flat for the first time in a decade last year. It remained around $243 billion worldwide after that explosive growth over the past decade that you see there. It went from $139 billion in 2014 to $243 billion by 2022. $100 billion worth of growth in content spending over less than 10 years. That's an incredible explosion of money. But again, this growth is essentially over now. It will resume growth this year, but at its slowest rate in recent memory. After that explosive growth I just talked about, Ampere Analysis, the source of this aggregate data, expects yearly growth of just 2% for 2024. That's about $4 billion. It'll go from around $243 billion last year to around $247 billion this year. And again, that's just the smallest growth we've seen recently for content spending. All these companies are being much more cautious about what they're pouring into streaming content. Now, on the right, you can see a Morgan Stanley forecast based on company reports and forecasts that breaks this down company by company. Disney is expected to be the biggest spender, as they usually are, around $33 billion this year. You can see it pretty quickly drops off from there. But more significant than just how much these companies are spending is where this money is going. Because companies have shown they're still willing to shell out for the right programming, which at this point mainly means sports broadcasts. Actually, ESPN just recently struck a deal for NCAA championship broadcasts, under which they'll pay more than $900 million over 8 years. So these companies are still spending money. It's just about where the money is going. Because analysts and industry observers expect that spending on what they call general entertainment TV is going to be more flat over the next few years. And what that means is essentially overall investment in TV won't be growing. And as companies spend more on theatrical movies and sports, there's going to be less money, less of their budgets, to go around for TV, which means fewer shows are going to have to be produced. Now, not all companies will be equally diminished in this regard. Netflix can pretty much keep spending whatever it wants. Netflix has had this triumphant comeback from their 2022 subscriber slump and the stock crash that went along with it. They hit a low of less than $200 per share in 2022, and as of this year, they're back up to $600 per share. That's been fueled by renewed subscriber growth with the password sharing crackdown. Show of hands, how many of you got kicked off of a Netflix account you were sharing? I bet it was more of you than that. You just don't want to admit it. That's okay. But because of how Wall Street looks at Netflix, and Netflix, by the way, is very profitable with their streaming operation, helps not to be weighed down by linear networks that are considered to be money losers. So because of that, Netflix is still able to spend, again, just pretty much at whatever level it wants to be spending. It has slowed down the growth of its content spending, but it's still putting out a lot of content. Even as its content output dipped last year, it was about a 22% drop, it still made up more than 40% of all the SVOD output last year. More than 40% of the original series released on these subscription streaming platforms last year. Netflix is still the king. There's just no other way to slice it. Now, what about these big tech companies that I talked about? Amazon, Apple. In coverage of these companies, we often hear, oh, these streaming costs are just a rounding error for them. That's the term that often gets thrown about. If these companies are valued at $1 trillion, what does it matter if they're losing a couple $1 billion on streaming? Or maybe even less than that, who knows? They don't disclose it. I'm not going to guess. But these companies can keep spending if they want to, but they may not want to. We've heard a lot of reports have come out in the last year that Amazon's leadership is taking a much closer look at how much money it's spending on TV. They've had some really expensive series that have not exactly set the ratings on fire. I don't want to get yelled at by PR, so I won't name check them here, but you can guess. So Amazon's taking a closer look at it. Apple has also produced a lot of expensive shows. They've had a huge hit in Ted Lasso, of course. That was the most streamed original streaming series last year, according to Nielsen data. But they've also produced a lot of things that nobody's watching, and they've also sunk a lot of money into these big theatrical plays, Killers of the Flower Moon, Napoleon, Argylle. These movies have also not set the box office on fire, right? So there's been reports coming out lately that even Apple may be taking a closer look at how much it's spending on streaming. What that'll look like, I can't really say. I kind of think if Tim Cook is really worried about how much money Killers of the Flower Moon made at the box office, he should be worried about other things. So the question from all of this becomes, how is TV going to change? I think the first thing that's clear is there's just going to be fewer shows being produced, fewer shows being commissioned. What you're looking at here is the number of new series orders by year, which means shows that are put into development or production. And new series ordered for SVOD only increased by about 30 titles in 2022, or about 4%, after an increase by more than 20% in both 2020 and 2021, 20% growth in the number of new shows they were ordering for these streaming platforms. And then the growth in that shrunk in 2022, as I said, and then it actually contracted last year in 2023. So this shows that the number of series being commissioned for streaming was already slowing down before the strikes. And you can also see evidence of the cable decline here. You'll notice it's pretty apparent. Cable's the black data here. Went from almost 700 new shows commissioned in 2019 to around 450 in 2020, and it's never recovered. It's continued to shrink each year since then. So there are far fewer original shows being commissioned for cable now. And now that streaming is also slowing down, there's just a massive contraction in the number of new shows that are being produced. And anecdotal evidence from around Hollywood also confirms this. If you read the trades at all, you've probably seen these stories where crew members are saying since the strikes ended, they expected to get back to work, but work has been a lot slower than people expected. There just isn't as much opportunity because there are fewer productions happening. And I wish I had better news for anyone here who's hoping to break into the TV industry, but the industry really is headed for a contraction. There is just not going to be the level of output that we had over the past decade. Now, we also have hard numbers for this. Production data shows how TV output is slowing down. You can see this slowdown in the chart on the left here. This shows the aggregate number of shoot days across all TV productions in the Los Angeles area, which is to say how many production days there were across all TV shows being produced in that region. So you may notice that in the last 3 quarters of 2022, again, before the strikes, these production days were already down year over year throughout the last 3 quarters. And an interesting fact about this is that pilots for new shows were actually down the entire year. There was no quarter in which the number of pilots being produced topped 2021 in 2022. Now, that was partly a correction from this production surge that happened after the COVID lockdown. There was a backlog of projects that needed to start shooting, so that's what kind of fueled this huge surge in 2021 of new productions. So that was not sustainable. There was always going to be a come down from that. But that Netflix stock crash, the streaming stock crash that I talked about, really accelerated that. So it should be clear, again, fewer shows are going to be made, but you may be wondering, what is this diminished slate going to look like? I think first and foremost, companies are going to be taking fewer risks on TV shows. Companies are likely going to prioritize spending on 4-quadrant blockbuster shows to cast as wide a net for new subscribers as possible. What does that mean? Well, think about what was the biggest success story for HBO last year? It wasn't Succession. It was The Last of Us, right? This show based on this popular video game IP, based in a genre, horror, sci-fi, and there's going to probably be a lot more shows like that being produced. These shows that are based in popular IP, these shows that cater to fan bases that already exist. So in other words, TV is going to look a lot more like current film studio slates. A lot of IP-based blockbuster content. There will be a handful of prestige awards bait titles thrown in there to keep the Emmys coming. Companies love to win awards. Although The Last of Us was up for several Emmys, so I think it's pretty well proven at this point that genre TV can still win awards. So not great news for anyone who wants to create the next Mad Men, unfortunately. There's going to be a lot fewer of those adult skewing type of dramas and comedies that were widely produced during peak TV. I think shows like Mad Men, maybe even shows like Atlanta, maybe even shows like The Bear would have a much tougher time getting greenlit right now. And those that do get made are going to have a much tougher battle to stay on the air. This era of secrecy around streaming ratings that we all got used to, a big reason that a lot of talent moved to streaming was to no longer be beholden to viewership data and ratings data, right? Well, that era is over. Netflix put out a huge viewership report recently, reporting hours watched for all their most popular content. And we have agencies like Nielsen measuring streaming ratings. And there's just more and more data popping up on this front. And actually, there needs to be legally a certain amount of reporting now, because there's provisions in the new Writers Guild and Actors Guild contracts that stipulate that ratings need to be reported to calculate how much money writers and actors are going to earn from their work. So shows are going to have to contend with rating scrutiny again. This era where nobody knew how much people were watching what, that's over. Now, the second big change that is going to happen now, there's going to be a much greater reliance on unscripted content. Regard this chart while I take a sip of water here. So, this is TV output broken down by scripted versus unscripted over the past 2 decades. And you'll notice that unscripted, there's always been more unscripted content being produced than scripted. But peak TV was really defined by this surge in original scripted content. You can see around 2014, 2015, that really starts to surge. That's when a lot of cable networks started releasing their own slates of original scripted content. That's when Netflix got into the game. Other streamers followed suit. So that's really fueled this explosion of scripted content that was offsetting all the unscripted content that was being produced, especially after the reality TV boom in the early 2000s. Now, this breaks it down a little more in detail. It's broken down by scripted and unscripted by platform. You can see broadcast on the bottom, then cable, then SVOD. And so as you can see, streaming actually has always been fueled more by scripted than unscripted. Even as there was much more unscripted content on cable, streaming really leaned into this original scripted content. But that is going to start changing. Streaming is going to start looking a lot more like cable, most likely. There's going to be fewer scripted originals being produced. These expensive dramas, very costly to produce. Unscripted is a lot cheaper. You can get more for your dollar with unscripted content, reality shows. Netflix has already proven that reality shows can work on streaming. Love is Blind, Too Hot to Handle. These are popular shows, right? So there's going to be a lot more unscripted content being produced in the streaming space. And also, in tandem with that, I think streaming is going to start relying a lot more on quote-unquote reruns, which is to say content, old shows, previously produced content that people watch over and over again. A lot of you admitted you're rewatching Gilmore Girls a lot. You're rewatching Friends, Grey's Anatomy on these platforms. And that pretty much shows that these companies spent way more money than they needed to on original scripted content. And let's remember, what was the biggest streaming success story of last year? Suits. Right? It was this old basic cable show that was licensed to Netflix and became an enormous hit on streaming because people were just watching it over and over again. And I think that's the type of phenomenon you're going to see start happening a lot more. More and more companies are licensing shows to Netflix now. Disney just started doing it again after pulling all their content off. Warner Brothers Discovery has been doing it for a while now. Sex and the City actually comes to Netflix April 1st. You can rewatch it there if you're not a Max subscriber. And it's a little ironic because Netflix needs this the least out of all these companies, right? They can still afford to spend as much as they want on original content, but they're the one platform that has proven that they can turn licensed content into a big hit. So all these companies are eager to license their content to Netflix, which is unfortunate for them, but it's good news for Netflix. They can cut back on what they're spending even more on original content if they want to. I've written several articles urging them to do that. They don't seem to have taken my advice. But now, one more likely shift that's going to happen in this post-peak TV environment, there's going to be a greater reliance on international TV, non-English language TV. We all know the big success story that was Squid Game. Disney Plus has had some hit Korean dramas lately. And in fact, last year, non-English language titles claimed their largest ever share of SVOD series released in the US. You can see this in the chart on the right, at the far end there. There was fully a third of the original shows released on SVOD last year were international shows, non-English language shows. And in fact, Luminate also measures genre subcategories, not just overarching genres like drama, comedy. They measure these subgenre categories. Foreign language was the single most common category observed for original shows on streaming in 2023. That's huge. That outstripped all other subgenre categories for the first time ever. Categories like, serialized drama, unscripted, that kind of thing. And that's mainly because of the strikes. International TV productions are not governed under the same labor contracts that domestic productions are. So they were able to, these companies were able to import shows to make up the difference for shows that couldn't be released because they weren't ready, because they had to shut down production because of the strikes. Now, that's unlikely to repeat this year, production's getting back on track. But post-peak TV, streamers are expected to lean more heavily on international content for one major reason. It's cheaper. These shows can be produced for less money internationally than shows typically cost in the US. They can be acquired for much less than you'd spend to create a new drama or comedy series shot here. And so that's the number one reason that these companies will be leaning more heavily on these shows. There's one other reason, though. The US streaming market has grown extremely mature, extremely saturated, right? It's getting harder and harder for companies to add more subscribers in the US. But there are other regions across the globe where they're less saturated. In fact, Variety Intelligence Platform, we just recently published a story about how Netflix is facing real competition in Africa. There's a streaming service there called Showmax that actually has more subscribers than Netflix has across the entire continent. And so there are these markets where these companies are going to start leaning into more localized content, content produced and made for these regions, which again will be much lower cost. Sub-Saharan Africa is one key market. Another one is India. That's a fast-growing economic and cultural force where Netflix especially is spending aggressively to try to get more subscribers. Ted Sarandos talks about this all the time, trying to grow their audience in India. And in fact, I'm going to make a prediction here. I would wager that an Indian series may very well become the next Squid Game. I think that we could see in the next few years an Indian series really become the next big breakout international hit. Now, I've talked a lot about this kind of bleak environment that is coming up for the TV industry. But there is a silver lining to all of this. The end of peak TV may actually benefit these legacy media companies, Disney, Warner Brothers Discovery, that have sank billions into original content. Because that strategy hasn't really worked, right? None of these companies have managed to catch Netflix. Disney got the closest, but they're still struggling. No other streaming company has even come close to rivaling Netflix's subscriber base, in spite of all this money that they've been pouring into pretty good original content. And so I would wager that a more moderated, a more considered content spending strategy, rather than just throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, that could really end up yielding similar rewards at a much lower cost. Remember, peak TV was defined by supply far exceeding demand. There were just way too many shows being produced, more options than anybody needed. And if Hollywood is moving away from this throw everything at the wall strategy, I think that could actually really benefit the health of the business in the long run. And last slide, I promise. There is consumer data to back this up. A major pitfall of the peak TV era has been choice paralysis among viewers. In surveys, consumers have often expressed frustration with the content discovery process on streaming, or in other words, the process of finding something to watch. Consumers have often noted in surveys that it can be hard to make a viewing decision because of these vast catalogs. Show of hands, how many of you have experienced this phenomenon of you go on Netflix, you scroll, you keep scrolling, and you just can't find anything to watch? A lot of you, right? Yeah, so because of that, I think that consumers may have an easier time finding something to watch, which means their experience on these platforms will get better if there are fewer new options coming out every single week. Now, many consumers do enjoy having so many viewing options, although there's a noteworthy little tidbit here in the chart on the left. This is a survey from Hub Entertainment Research that they've run every year, asking consumers about their opinion of peak TV. What you're looking at here is the share of consumers who strongly agree with the statement, I like having so many TV shows, I know I'll always be able to find something to watch. 2023, last year, is when that proportion actually peaked. It topped 40% for the first time. And what happened last year? There was actually less new TV content being released than in the years prior. So this suggests that consumers will actually be okay with lessened TV output. And as we've noted, I polled the room, many users are also prone to return to old favorite shows rather than watch a lot of these new original series. And again, this basically means that these companies were way overspending on content during the peak TV era. They can spend a lot less and still get similar results. Now, I'd like to field one more theory here. Roll with me on this. This end of the prestige TV era that I've been talking about, where there will be fewer of these artsy prestige dramas and comedies being produced. I think that could actually, economically speaking, be beneficial for everybody in the industry. I think streamers and writers alike especially could profit from a return to something more in line with what network TV used to look like. Shows with broader appeal, shows with less extravagant budgets, shows with longer seasons, and shows with episodes released weekly. Most companies, most streamers are already going back to this. The binge release model is kind of going away. And that's because it's easier, of course, to hold on to viewers when they have to wait week by week for the new episode of whatever show they're watching, rather than being able to binge it all in a weekend. I think even, I don't know, journalists have been predicting for years that Netflix is going to move away from this model. They have started dropping more seasons in halves. They'll do part 1 in 1 month, part 2 in the next month. I think the reasons for that are obvious. They're trying to get you to stick around for an extra month to catch the back half of Bridgerton season 3 or whatever. So that's beneficial. That'll keep more subscribers on streaming platforms for longer periods of time. But longer seasons also are beneficial for writers because per the new WGA contract that was reached last year, longer seasons require more writers to be staffed per season on a show. So With studios cutting back on their output and making fewer shows, shows with longer seasons are basically writers' best bet for keeping as many people employed as possible in this peak TV environment, post-peak TV environment, sorry. The steady seasonal work of the network TV era, that's probably never coming back. But a return to, say, 20-episode seasons instead of these 8 to 10 episode seasons, or sometimes even 6-episode seasons, that would keep more writers working for longer periods of time. And of course, the benefits of widening shows' appeal, that should be obvious, right? More people will watch. And this success-based streaming residual that I talked about earlier, this is a provision in the new writers and actors' new contracts that gives them a bonus payment if shows meet a certain viewership threshold. Excuse me. That requires shows to meet the equivalent of 20% of a streaming platform's domestic subscriber base. That's a lot. That's more than most streaming shows can possibly hope to meet. So this is going to necessitate a less, shall we say, artisanal approach than many signature shows of the peak TV era took. And it's going to mean a return to these broader sensibilities that define network television. So, to sum everything up, a new era of TV is coming. It's unclear exactly what it's going to look like, but I've outlined many likely qualities of it. And it may result in far fewer classic shows, far fewer experiments, less artistic daring, but there is a chance it could put Hollywood on a path to getting its business model back on track. Hollywood really is in a dire place right now. If you've looked at all at media stocks recently, they are, to put it mildly, not doing well. Wall Street is not valuing these companies highly because of their declining linear TV operations, at the same time that they cannot seem to get over the profitability hump with streaming. But if maybe by adopting some of these strategies, making fewer shows, making shows with broader appeal, perhaps that could, again, put Hollywood on a path to a healthier business model. And so maybe that means that the death of peak TV doesn't have to be such a mournful occasion after all. So that's all I have. We will now move on to Q&A from the audience. I believe I can access that here. Oh, thank you. All right. So feel free to keep submitting questions on the app. I'll get through as many as I can here. First question I'm seeing here is, could the decline in streaming services and the end of peak TV be due to platforms like TikTok with its vast and cost-efficient content creator base? Actually, yes, I believe so. That's also a factor. As we've discussed, there's many factors at work here. And younger audiences are spending more time on TikTok, surveys have shown, data has shown, than they're spending with streaming platforms and TV shows. They're more interested in this user-generated content that is curated, especially for them, than they are in TV, professionally produced TV on streaming platforms. So absolutely, TikTok is absolutely playing a factor in this. Let's see. Next question, we keep hearing it's very expensive to shoot in LA. Do you see more productions leaving LA? Are they going out of state or out of the US? That's an interesting question. I mean, shows have always moved out of LA. There are, tax incentives, things like that, that make it more economically beneficial to shoot elsewhere. There are more productions being shot overseas now. Shows like House of the Dragon have fully international production bases. So it's possible. It's hard to say for sure whether I see more productions leaving LA. I think LA will always continue to be a real production hub, at least for the foreseeable future. But it's possible that you could see a more careful consideration of where the best location is to shoot economically, although that is something that companies usually take into consideration already. Question here, what's next in terms of streaming monetization? Bundling sounds like yet another media exec pipe dream given media's continuing fragmentation. That's true. I do think that consumers will be more inclined to subscribe to multiple platforms if they're not having to subscribe to so many, right? There's just so many platforms out there, it's hard for people to justify subscribing to every single one. And as we see more consolidation, I think that the convenience of that, the lowered cost of that, will draw more consumers into these bundled platforms. And that question also noted ads aren't enough. I mean, streaming ads are going to become a bigger business as more and more ad dollars shift away from linear TV. That's not to be underestimated. I also think that the amount of ads that you're seeing on streaming is going to go up quite a bit over the next few years. These days of just seeing, 2 or 3 ads during breaks in programming, those days are coming to an end for sure. Let's see. Someone asked me if TV gravitates, clicked away from the Q&A. That's no good. There we go. Someone asked if, as TV gravitates toward broader reaching blockbuster type content, how do you feel this will affect the theatrical business? It's hard to say. I mean, it's hard to see the theatrical business being in a worse place than it's been in the last few years, but things can always get worse. Although you'll never go broke predicting the death of the theatrical movie business. People have been doing that literally since television came along for the first time. So it's a good question. I mean, certainly there's already plenty of competition between the theatrical business and this blockbuster type content that people can watch at home. I think that we're going to see more and more of a push towards these experiences or these films like Dune 2, like Oppenheimer, that really demand to be seen on these premium large format screens. No matter how good your theater setup is at home, it's not going to be as good as sitting front row IMAX for Dune Part 2. That we just haven't gotten there yet. Maybe we will one day. I'm sure Tim Cook would like me to say that the Vision Pro will help us get there. We'll see. I just think that the amount of competition that we've seen is going to continue, and I think that the theatrical business is really going to be driven more towards these premium experiences. Next question. What does this mean in terms of diversity and representation on screen? It seems like making shows for broad audiences is a step back. I've heard this a fair amount. I think that Hollywood would bet against diversity at its own peril. I think there are plenty of examples that show that diversity is a successful strategy for bringing in audiences. Black Panther is probably the prime example. But cutting back on, shall we say, artisanal shows, broadening the tent, that doesn't have to mean cutting back on diversity and representation. I don't know. I'm a bit of a pessimist. I tend to think that Hollywood doesn't take, shall we say, a constant path upwards in terms of positive representation, things like that. But hopefully that these companies will realize that diversity can be a good thing for their bottom line. Next question. How much of the content spend slowness that we're seeing is because of studio hesitancy to start new shows ahead of a possible IATSE Teamster strike later this year? I think that's certainly a factor. I don't think that the business wants to believe that another strike is going to happen, another prolonged production shutdown. I mean, if you read interviews with members of these unions, certainly they strike a similar tone that SAG-AFTRA in particular struck last year before they struck. And so I'm not going to comment on the likelihood of whether that strike happens, but I would think that that hesitancy is playing a factor. Certainly it's not the main factor. Again, these cutbacks that have happened post-streaming wars, I think are the biggest factor here, but that may be weighing on people's minds for sure. Let's see. With TV moving to an IP-led model, does that bode well for streamers like Disney or Warner Brothers Discovery, who have the largest libraries of global IP? Hard to say. I don't know that it does. I mean, Disney certainly had a great library of IP before all of this happened, and they were certainly leaning into it pretty heavily. Shows like The Mandalorian, all these Marvel shows that were on Disney+. And in some ways, that kind of did more harm than good, right? Marvel kind of got oversaturated to the point where it finally hurt their theatrical product. Star Wars, not all of those shows, I think, were at the levels that Disney really wanted them to be at. So, we always hear content is king, and certainly that's very true, but it only goes so far. And I think that really the biggest consideration that these companies need to be thinking about is how to start new franchises and where to mine IP that hasn't been overmined yet, that hasn't been completely oversaturated yet. I mean, Disney Plus just had its biggest hit in a while with the Percy Jackson series. That was an IP that was ripe to be mined for a new series and hadn't really fully oversaturated the culture yet. There'd been those 2 movies that everybody forgot about. So I think that the bigger concern, rather than just having IP that has already been exploited over and over again, the big challenge here and what will really make the difference is who's able to create new, fresh franchises that audiences can get excited about. In other words, don't count on DC shows to fuel massive growth for Warner Brothers Discovery's streaming platforms. Let's see. Interesting question here. Apple TV Plus's model is uniquely about showing original content. Do you think this will be problematic for growth if they stick with this model? Possibly. I mean, Apple TV Plus, they've never publicly reported their subscriber numbers. Most estimates put them quite low, around the 40 million subscriber mark. It's hard to say how accurate that is. I actually have advocated for Apple growing its library through some kind of acquisition, some kind of legacy library acquisition. Certainly, there are more and more of these legacy media companies going up for sale. Paramount certainly is having conversations with anybody who's interested right now. So I think there's a possibility that we could see Apple start to think more seriously about beefing up its library. But again, the real question mark there, what will make a difference there, is how much Tim Cook and the senior leadership at Apple really care about beefing up their streaming platform. I did just recently see what I thought was a pretty smart take, which is that Apple TV Plus, the purpose of it is really going to be fueling growth and adoption of the Vision Pro, of Apple's headsets. I think that's a smart take. I think that we are going to see Apple really trying to sell these devices through Apple TV Plus, kind of the way that iTunes was used to sell the iPod and the iPhone. So maybe original content will be enough for that. They have shown a willingness to partner with some of these companies without engaging in M&A. Disney is supplying content to the Vision Pro. So we may see more in that vein. Apple historically has not been a huge mover and shaker in the M&A space, but it's possible. I think certainly a lot of the old rules about how the media and tech businesses work have changed a lot in just the last few years. Let's see. Someone asked about AI. I suppose it was only a matter of time. What do you think the effect will be of AI if it indeed does reduce production costs and make niche content and localization more affordable? Well, that's a good question. I think that certainly if production costs are able to go down significantly, we very well could see the number of shows start ramping up again. I think it could be a while before that happens. I think it's going to be a while before these companies fully have a handle on how best to use AI, how to kind of navigate making sure that there's still a human presence to it, making sure it's used as a tool without creating just totally subpar content. I don't think we've seen any evidence that AI can really, in spite of all the hype over Sora, I don't think that AI is quite where it needs to be yet to really bring costs down to facilitate the kind of high quality shows that people want to see from these platforms. Certainly, it's going to have a substantial impact. Localization is a good point, actually. It's going to make translating shows a lot easier. Anime companies are already starting to look at the possibilities for generating subtitles with AI. So there will certainly be, I think that's where the biggest impact is going to happen first. I think that we're going to see a bigger impact in animation, in anime, things like that, before we see a huge transformation of the way live action content is produced. But certainly this technology is developing a lot faster than a lot of people have predicted. So again, the classic Hollywood refrain is nobody knows anything. So we'll see what happens. What do you think about streaming services attempting to create something similar to broadcast channels within their platforms? That's a good question. Now, there is already something like this called FAST. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this. Free ad-supported streaming television. These are these platforms like Tubi, like the Roku channel, like Pluto TV, that are mainly stocked with library content that would be shown on linear TV channels. Reruns, movies, shows that the parent companies own, interspersed with ads. And that is quickly becoming a bigger business. I mean, there's been a lot of growth in usership of these platforms over the last couple of years. And even some of these companies are starting to invest more in original content now. Roku channel and Tubi especially. There was also Amazon's Freevee platform, had a big hit last year with Jury Duty. That was an original series that was unique to that platform. So these platforms will probably start producing more originals. I don't think they're going to get up to the volume that we saw on SVOD just because they don't quite have the budget capabilities to produce massive slates of original content. But there will be an uptick there. Now, as far as integrating something like linear channels into SVOD platforms like Netflix, I think that's a really good idea. It kind of boggles my mind. I don't know why Netflix doesn't have like a linear channel option where you can just pop in, see what's on, and just watch it. I think that consumers think they want a lot more choice than they actually do. I think these companies think that consumers want a lot more choice than they actually do. So that's a free idea. And I think if these companies are smart, they'll start investing more in building out these kind of linear channels within their paid streaming platforms. So if anyone's listening, I think that's a great idea. All right. I think that's about it. Thank you all again for joining. And if you have any more questions for me, I'll be around. Thank you so much.